On February 15th, 1564, a child was born in the city of Pisa, Italy, who would leave a lasting mark on the history of human thought. His name was Galileo Galilei. The sound of his name carried a melodic rhythm, yet he would come to be known simply as Galileo. In Italy, this honour was reserved for figures of exceptional brilliance, such as the artist Michelangelo. Even during his lifetime, Galileo's works were printed under his first name alone, and today encyclopedias continue this tradition. He entered the world during the Renaissance, a period defined by renewed curiosity, artistic achievement, and scientific exploration. Europe was awakening to new possibilities. In the same year that Galileo was born, the playwright William Shakespeare entered the world in England, while the great Michelangelo passed away. These three individuals would each rise to represent the extraordinary cultural flowering of their age. The Renaissance had been shaped by profound changes. The printing press, invented in 1454, allowed books to be produced far more rapidly than before. As books became more available, literacy spread, and ideas travelled faster than ever. Artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci transformed the visual arts. Explorers revealed continents previously unknown to Europeans. Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, and in 1522 the expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan completed the first voyage around the globe. In 1607, during Galileo's adulthood, English settlers founded the colony of Jamestown in North America. Galileo's birthplace, Pisa, was an ancient city along the river Arno. Its cathedral had already stood for 5 centuries. Beside it rose the Leaning Tower of Pisa, already tilting long before Galileo's time, its slant giving the impression that it might fall at any moment. Galileo was the eldest child of a family of noble lineage, though not of great wealth. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician who sang, played the lute, and composed music. He also wrote works on music theory that challenged traditional practices. At the time, music was bound by strict rules, yet Vincenzo questioned these limitations and even proposed adding new tones to the musical scale. His ideas stirred controversy. Some scholars sought to prevent the publication of his writings, but he persevered. He once declared, "I wish to be allowed freely to question in search of truth." His young son listened closely. The same desire to question accepted beliefs would later become a hallmark of Galileo's scientific career. From childhood, Galileo showed an exceptional curiosity. He examined the mechanics of objects by taking them apart, and he created small inventions of his own. He studied music and drawing, continuing to play the lute throughout his life. Tutors introduced him to drawing in perspective, a technique that allowed artists to create images with depth and realism. This skill would later assist him in accurately recording his scientific observations. When Galileo was 8, the family moved to Florence after Vincenzo accepted a respected position at the royal court. Galileo initially remained in Pisa with tutors, then later joined his family. Florence was one of the great centres of Renaissance culture, filled with scholars, artists, and intellectual debate. Through his father's court position, the family had contact with nobles and influential figures. At 11, Galileo was placed in a monastery school, where Catholic monks instructed him in Greek, Latin, logic, and religious studies. He became so drawn to religious life that he considered becoming a monk. This alarmed his father, who reminded him of his duty as the eldest son to support the family. To prevent him from taking vows, Vincenzo withdrew him from the monastery and enrolled him in a day school that allowed him to remain at home. By the age of 17, Galileo was ready for university. Higher education was a privilege reserved for young men of noble or wealthy families. Women were barred entirely. Despite the financial strain, Vincenzo remained committed to giving his gifted son the best education available, believing he was destined for a life of achievement. In 1581, Galileo returned to his native Pisa to begin his studies. His father hoped he would pursue medicine, a profession known for its stability and respect. Yet once Galileo settled into university life, it became clear that his interests would soon lead him in a very different direction. He stood out among his peers not only for his reddish hair and curly beard, but for his keen interest in debate. Galileo questioned accepted ideas and examined every lesson with a critical mind. His classmates gave him the nickname the Wrangler, a reflection of his willingness to challenge assumptions and argue with conviction. Not all of his professors appreciated this bold style. Some felt unsettled by a student who refused to simply accept tradition, yet others, including many fellow students, admired his intellect and friendly nature. Galileo formed lasting friendships and inspired strong opinions throughout his life. People tended either to admire him deeply or to oppose him just as strongly. A single lecture would alter the course of his future. Galileo came to understand that nature followed orderly patterns, all governed by laws that could be expressed through mathematics. In later writings, he explained that the universe could only be understood through this language, composed of shapes such as triangles and circles. From that moment, Galileo turned fully toward mathematics. He began to notice patterns in everyday life. In the cathedral at Pisa, he observed a large hanging lamp drifting gently after being adjusted by a workman. The lamp swung with a steady rhythm. Galileo measured the motion using his own pulse. He found that each swing took the same amount of time, even as the arc of the swing became smaller. In private, he repeated the experiment many times. His results were consistent. A pendulum, he discovered, keeps a constant rhythm unless the length of its chain is changed. Galileo was 19 when he identified what would later be known as the law of the pendulum. Today, scientific theories are routinely tested through experiment, but in Galileo's time this approach was rare. He became one of the first to insist on observation, testing, and proof. For this reason, Galileo is often called the father of modern science. His dedication to mathematics, however, came at a cost. He lost interest in studying medicine, and in 1585, after 4 years at the University of Pisa, he left without completing his degree. Galileo returned to Florence and began offering private lessons in mathematics. He also delivered public lectures and continued to investigate natural phenomena. He studied the movement of water, asking why certain objects float and what forces shape the flow of streams. His work led to the invention of a device that allowed farmers to draw water for irrigation. He then designed a new type of balance scale, one that allowed jewelers to determine the purity of metals by placing part of the instrument in water and part in air. Galileo described this invention in his first published work, The Little Balance. As his reputation grew, word of his skill travelled across Italy. In 1589, the University of Pisa invited him to return, not as a student, but as a professor of mathematics. It was a remarkable turn in fortune. Only a few years earlier he had left the university without a degree. Now he returned as a scholar, ready to teach others. Yet Galileo's return to Pisa was not without controversy. The new mathematics instructor soon attracted attention, and not always the kind he hoped for. He refused to wear the traditional black academic robes, garments meant to symbolize dignity and status. He considered them impractical and uncomfortable. He even composed a satirical poem mocking the attire. The university did not share his humour, and his salary was reduced as punishment. At this time, universities across Europe based much of their teaching on the writings of Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher whose works had shaped scholarly thought for centuries. Aristotle's explanations of nature were regarded with near unquestioned authority. Galileo was expected to repeat these teachings to his students. Yet privately he began to doubt some of Aristotle's conclusions. One claim in particular suggested that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. The idea appeared self-evident. A hammer, after all, seems to fall more quickly than a feather. But Galileo observed the world closely. When hailstones of varying sizes fell to the ground, they struck the earth almost simultaneously. From these observations he concluded that objects fall at the same rate, regardless of weight. Many scholars dismissed the notion. To question Aristotle was, in their eyes, to question the very foundation of learning. According to a well-known account, Galileo decided to demonstrate his idea in a dramatic way. He gathered several professors and climbed the Leaning Tower of Pisa. From its height, he released 2 spheres, one 10 pounds in weight and the other only 1 pound. Contrary to Aristotle's teaching, both struck the ground at nearly the same moment, with only the air slowing one more than the other. To Galileo, the demonstration confirmed his conclusion. To critics, it confirmed only his reputation for defiance. His students, however, admired him. Galileo's lectures were energetic, clear and bold. The room often filled to capacity. At times, other professors attended simply to interrupt or challenge him, but this did little to dim his influence on his pupils. By 1591, his 3-year contract in Pisa was ending, and Galileo understood he would not be asked to remain. The timing was difficult. His father had recently died, leaving him responsible for his mother, his younger sisters, and his brother. He needed employment quickly. That opportunity came from the University of Padua, which offered him a position teaching mathematics with improved pay. Padua had a reputation for intellectual openness and inquiry, a place where ideas could be tested and debated freely. It was well suited to Galileo's manner of thought, yet Galileo left Pisa with few financial resources. Unable to afford a horse, he travelled the 100 miles to Padua on foot, beginning a new chapter in his life and work. In later years, Galileo would often look back on this chapter as the most fulfilling of his life. He arrived at the university at the age of 28, and before long was appointed head of the mathematics department. He would hold that post for 18 years. Padua attracted young noblemen and scholars from across Europe. When they returned to their homelands, they carried news of Galileo's ideas and teaching. His reputation spread steadily. During these years, he formed a close circle of colleagues and friends, many of whom were among the most thoughtful and inventive minds of their era. Nearby, Venice soon became one of his favoured destinations. Reached by ferry along quiet waterways, the city was a place of graceful canals and distinguished architecture. Its palaces held celebrated works of art, and its streets echoed with the energy of trade and culture. It was during these visits that Galileo met Marina Gamba. Their relationship, though strong and enduring, existed outside the conventions of the time. Social expectations made marriage difficult, as scholars were encouraged to remain unmarried, and Marina came from a lower social class. Still, they built a family together. Their daughter Virginia was born in 1600, followed by Livia in 1601, and their son Vincenzio in 1606, named in honour of Galileo's father. Galileo cared for Marina and the children, and arranged a home for them only a short walk from his own residence. Although the relationship changed later in life, and Marina eventually married another, she and Galileo remained on respectful terms. Yet life in Padua was not without hardship. On one summer afternoon, Galileo and two friends rested in an underground chamber cooled by air drawn from a nearby cave. Unbeknown to them, the air carried toxic gases. All three fell gravely ill. One man died the following day, the second passed soon after. Galileo survived, but his health never fully returned. Periods of illness would affect him throughout his remaining years. At the same time, responsibility weighed heavily on him. He supported not only Marina and their children, but also his mother and siblings. Financial strain was constant. The cost of his sister's dowry alone equalled an entire year of his earnings. To supplement his income, Galileo turned to invention. In 1597, he designed an instrument known as the geometric and military compass. Resembling two metal rulers marked with measurements, it allowed the user to solve complex calculations with relative ease. Bankers used it to assess currency values. Shipbuilders used it to test scale models. Military officers used it to calculate cannon charges and battlefield formations. Soon after, he developed an early form of the thermometer, known as a thermoscope. It functioned by drawing water up a glass tube in response to heat, a basic principle still used in thermometers today. Galileo also continued to study motion. He knew that objects accelerated as they fell, gaining speed over time, but he sought to understand precisely how this change occurred. To observe the process more closely, he slowed it down. He constructed an inclined wooden ramp and arranged small bells along its length. A metal ball descending the ramp would strike the bells in sequence, allowing him to measure the rate of acceleration. After repeated trials, he identified a pattern in the increasing speed, a pattern he described using the series 1, 3, 5, 7. He confirmed the result again and again by adjusting the angle of the ramp. Then, in 1609, news reached him of a new device created in the Netherlands. It used lenses to make distant objects appear closer. Galileo did not yet know that this simple instrument would alter the course of his work, and the course of scientific history. The device had been developed only the year before by a Dutch lensmaker, Hans Lippershey, who placed two carefully shaped lenses at opposite ends of a narrow tube. This arrangement allowed distant objects to appear several times larger and was known as a spyglass. At first, the spyglass was treated as little more than a curiosity. Yet Galileo immediately saw its greater value. Venice commanded the most powerful navy in Europe, and the ability to see approaching ships hours before they reached the harbour could shift the balance of power. Galileo understood that this new device held strategic potential. He set to work learning the delicate craft of grinding and polishing lenses. Within days, he created an instrument equal to Lippershey's, and soon after, one that surpassed it. His improved design magnified objects tenfold. What had begun as a novelty was transformed into a useful scientific tool. People soon adopted a new name for the device. They called it a telescope, from the Greek root meaning to see far. Galileo travelled to Venice to present his telescope to the city's leaders. One by one, senators looked through the instrument and saw distant ships long before they became visible to the unaided eye. Recognizing its value, the Venetian government rewarded Galileo with a significant increase in salary and a lifetime appointment at the University of Padua. Back in Padua, Galileo continued refining his work. He ground and adjusted lenses repeatedly, each time improving clarity and magnification. Eventually, he produced a telescope capable of enlarging objects 20 to 30 times more than the human eye. With this instrument, he turned his gaze to the sky. In late November of 1609, Galileo pointed the telescope toward the pale arc of light known as the Milky Way. What had appeared as a cloudy band resolved into countless stars, densely clustered in the depths of space. On other nights, he examined the constellation of Orion and recorded dozens of stars never before seen. He wrote that it had pleased God to allow him to witness a marvel hidden through the ages. When he directed his telescope to the moon, he observed a surface marked by mountains, valleys, and craters, contradicting the long-held belief that it was perfectly smooth. By measuring the shadows cast across the lunar surface, he calculated the height of the moon's mountains with remarkable accuracy. Each night he sketched what he saw, preserving the landscape in careful detail. Then, in January of 1610, he made a discovery that changed the understanding of the cosmos. Pointing his telescope toward Jupiter, he saw 3 small points of light nearby. At first he believed they were stars, but night after night their positions changed. Soon a 4th appeared. Galileo realized that these bodies were not stars at all. They were moons orbiting Jupiter. No new celestial bodies had been discovered in the solar system for more than 1,500 years. In the span of only 8 weeks, Galileo revealed wonders that reshaped humanity's view of the universe. His observations represent some of the most influential achievements ever made by a single astronomer. Eager to share these discoveries, Galileo began to record his findings in a written work, illustrating it with his own careful drawings of the moon and the stars. He titled the book The Starry Messenger. The name referred both to the telescope that had carried his vision into the heavens and to Galileo himself, as a messenger delivering new knowledge from above. He wrote the book in Latin, the common scholarly language of Europe, allowing it to reach readers far beyond Italy. Upon publication, it spread rapidly, gaining attention in major intellectual centres and making Galileo widely known. Galileo also hoped that his discoveries would attract the support of a powerful patron. During the Renaissance, scholars often relied on influential families to fund their work. The Medici family ruled Tuscany and had long supported artists, scientists, and thinkers. Galileo dedicated the Starry Messenger to Grand Duke Cosimo II, the head of the Medici household. He presented both the book and the telescope he had used in his observations, and he named the 4 newly discovered moons of Jupiter the Median stars in honour of the Grand Duke's 4 brothers. These moons are known today as Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. The dedication achieved its intended result. Galileo was appointed chief mathematician and philosopher to the court. With this position, he no longer needed to teach for income and could devote himself fully to study and research. He left Padua and settled in Florence, close to the Medici court. However, the success of the Starry Messenger brought controversy as well. Many of Galileo's observations contradicted the teachings of Aristotle, whose works had shaped scientific thought for centuries. Supporters of Aristotle criticized Galileo sharply. Some claimed he had made errors. Others argued that the telescope produced distortions, and that the celestial bodies he described did not truly exist. Galileo was troubled by these objections. He believed his critics were refusing to look for themselves, relying instead on ancient authority. He remarked that they behaved as if the universe had been written only to be read by Aristotle. In his view, even Aristotle, faced with the evidence of the telescope, would have accepted the truth of what it revealed. Galileo continued his observations. Night after night he studied the planet Venus and saw that it changed form, moving through phases similar to the moon. The only explanation was that Venus orbited the Sun and reflected its light. If Venus circled the Sun, then Earth must do so as well. This view challenged the accepted belief that Earth stood motionless at the centre of the universe, with the Sun and planets revolving around it. Galileo supported the model first proposed by Nicholas Copernicus in 1543, which placed the Sun at the centre. Many people resisted this idea, as they saw the Sun appear to move across the sky each day. Galileo explained that Earth was rotating, creating the appearance of motion. As Galileo's claims spread, criticism intensified. To defend his findings, he travelled to Rome in 1611, bringing his telescope with him. His visit was well received. A respected scientific society welcomed him as a member, joining him with leading thinkers from across Europe. He remained in correspondence with them for many years. The Catholic Church reviewed his discoveries and accepted his observations of the heavens. Yet acceptance of the evidence did not extend to acceptance of his conclusions about Earth's motion. On that question, disagreement remained. More conflict lay ahead. In the years that followed, criticism of Galileo only intensified. As he continued to present findings that challenged long-held beliefs, resistance grew louder. He demonstrated that the Sun bore dark, shifting patches now known as sunspots. He showed that whether an object floated depended on its density rather than its size. His conclusions were supported by careful measurement and observation, yet the idea that unsettled people most was his continued insistence that Earth was not the centre of the universe. Books soon appeared challenging his ideas. Galileo responded directly. His sharp intellect was matched by sharp language, and his replies could be severe. To one critic he wrote, "Your ignorance astounds me." Those who supported him, a loyal group of scholars, referred humorously to his opponents as the Pigeon League, suggesting that their thinking lacked depth. During this same period, Galileo faced a deeply personal decision. In 1613 he arranged for his daughters, Virginia, then 13, and Livia, 12, to enter a convent. Opportunities for women in that era were limited, and this path secured their future. The girls remained there for the rest of their lives. When Virginia took her vows at 16, she chose the name Maria Celeste. The name Celeste, meaning of the heavens, may have reflected her admiration for her father's work among the stars. Meanwhile, opposition to Galileo's ideas took a more dangerous form. Critics argued that the sun-centered model contradicted Scripture. They labelled the theory heresy. This accusation deeply concerned Galileo. He was a committed Catholic and had no desire to stand against the Church. He believed that faith and scientific inquiry served different purposes. He often quoted the words of a cardinal who had said, "The Bible is a book about how one goes to heaven, not how heaven goes." To explain his views, Galileo wrote a 40-page letter discussing the relationship between science and faith. He argued that Scripture was infallible, but that interpretations of Scripture could be mistaken. The letter circulated widely and eventually reached the Roman Inquisition. After review, the Inquisition judged it harmless. Still, Galileo worried that church leaders were being influenced by those who misunderstood his work. In 1616, determined to clarify the matter, Galileo travelled to Rome once more. He believed that a straightforward explanation would resolve the issue. "Good philosophers like eagles fly alone," he said, "not in flocks like starlings." In Rome, he spoke confidently and openly. His determination, however, unsettled the ambassador from Tuscany, who feared Galileo's boldness might lead to conflict. "He will get himself into trouble," the ambassador warned. "He is stubborn and very worked up in this matter." The Inquisition convened to issue a ruling. Galileo was not allowed to speak in his own defence. The Church declared the teachings of Copernicus foolish and absurd, and affirmed that Earth remained at the centre of creation. Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, known for his uncompromising role in trials of religious dissent, was assigned to deliver the decision. He met Galileo with courtesy but conveyed a clear directive. Galileo was forbidden from teaching or defending the idea that Earth moved around the Sun. To persist, the cardinal warned, would be a very dangerous thing. Galileo's hopes of persuading the Church came to an end. He returned to Florence in silence. For the next 7 years he complied with the order and focused on new areas of study. He constructed one of the earliest microscopes and examined small insects in vivid detail. "The flea is quite horrible," he wrote, "while the gnat and the moth are very beautiful." Then, in 1623, the situation changed. A new pope was elected. Pope Urban VIII was known to be more receptive to scientific inquiry, and he held a personal admiration for Galileo. He had even written a poem in Galileo's honour. Galileo wasted no time in returning to Rome. He believed the moment to reopen the discussion had arrived. During his visit to Rome in 1624, Galileo was granted several audiences with Pope Urban VIII. The two men walked together through the quiet paths of the Vatican gardens, speaking of astronomy, philosophy, and the nature of the cosmos. Galileo asked whether the Church might lift its ban on teaching the theories of Copernicus. Although Urban had expressed reservations about the ban years earlier, he now refused to remove it. He continued to support the traditional view rooted in Aristotle. However, he permitted Copernicus's ideas to be discussed, provided they were presented only as theoretical possibilities, not established fact. He issued one caution. Galileo must always state that the sun-centered model remained unproven. With this guidance, Galileo returned home and began work on a new book. He structured it as a conversation between three individuals over the course of 4 days. The first, Sagredo, served as a thoughtful moderator. The second, Salviati, argued in favour of Copernicus. The third, Simplicio, defended the long-held Aristotelian view. The very name Simplicio, close to the word meaning simple-minded, hinted at Galileo's own perspective. Unlike his earlier work, Galileo wrote this book in Italian rather than Latin. He wanted his ideas available not only to scholars, but to the general public. He explained complex concepts in clear language and added notes and detailed illustrations in the margins. The result was engaging and accessible. The finished work, titled Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, became a masterpiece of both science and literature. The manuscript was completed in 1630, though illness slowed its progress. Before publication, it required approval from church censors in Rome. Then, at the worst possible moment, the plague returned. The outbreak swept across Tuscany, closing roads and isolating towns. Communication with Rome was disrupted. At last, the church permitted censors in Florence to review the manuscript, and the work was approved. In 1632, the dialogue was published. Galileo's supporters welcomed it enthusiastically. His critics, however, reacted with alarm. Although the book was framed as a debate, it was clear to most readers that Galileo favoured the sun-centred model. What followed was something Galileo did not anticipate. Pope Urban VIII, once his admirer, now turned sharply against him. Europe was divided by intense religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and the Pope was under pressure to assert authority. Galileo's opponents whispered that the character of Simplicio had been intended as an insult to the Pope himself. Whether or not this was Galileo's intention, the suggestion had its effect. Urban was outraged. He ordered the Roman Inquisition to investigate Galileo. A summons was issued. The charge was heresy. Galileo's doctors argued that he was too ill to make the journey to Rome. The Inquisition responded with a single message: he would come willingly, or he would be taken in chains. And so, Galileo returned to Rome. He was 70 years old when he came to stand trial before the Inquisition. Although the Pope could have ordered his imprisonment, consideration was given to his age and reputation. He was permitted to stay at the Medici embassy, where he was treated with courtesy and respect. The Inquisition showed no such softness. Its judges remained formal and polite, but their questioning was persistent and exacting. The trial extended over 10 weeks. Though Galileo appeared in the courtroom on only 4 of those days, the first session took place on April 12, 1633. The judges charged him with supporting the teachings of Copernicus, declaring the claim to be heresy. They asserted that Galileo had disobeyed the Church's instructions given during his earlier visit in 1616. Records were brought forward stating that Galileo had been ordered not to hold, teach, or defend the sun-centered model in any form. Galileo was stunned. This account differed greatly from what he remembered. He presented a letter signed by Cardinal Bellarmine in 1616, which in his view permitted him to discuss Copernicus as a hypothesis. He believed that in his book this was precisely what he had done. The judges, however, insisted that their records were authoritative. By the end of the first day, Galileo understood that the court intended to condemn him. Days passed before the next hearing. During that time, church officials reviewed dialogue concerning the two chief world systems once more. Their conclusion was firm. Galileo had indeed argued in favour of the Copernican view. One reviewer wrote, "He regards as foolish all who are not followers of Copernicus. it is clear what he intends. At the second hearing, Galileo no longer attempted to defend himself. The threat before him had become unmistakable. He was elderly, in declining health, and aware of the consequences faced by others before him. He stated that he had been too forceful in the book and had pressed certain arguments too strongly. On the third day, the verdict was delivered. Galileo was guilty. He faced the full penalties of heresy. The court had the authority to torment him or sentence him to death, yet the judges offered a path to leniency. If he publicly renounced his support for Copernicus, the punishment would be reduced. Galileo yielded. He did not wish to stand against the Church, and he feared the suffering that might follow. On June 22, 1633, he appeared in court for the final time. Dressed in a plain white robe to show repentance, he knelt and read the prepared statement. I, Galileo, son of the late Vincenzo Galilei of Florence, 70 years of age, abandon completely the false opinion that the sun is at the centre of the world and does not move, and that the earth is not the centre and moves. Even after this confession, the Inquisition imposed penalties meant to discourage others. The statement was ordered to be posted at universities. His book was banned, and existing copies were to be destroyed. Galileo was prohibited from publishing further works. Then the final sentence was pronounced. Galileo would live the remainder of his life under house arrest. The emotional toll was profound. Within a year, on April 2, 1634, his daughter, Maria Celeste, his closest companion, died after a short illness at the age of 33. Her loss brought deep sorrow. I continually hear my beloved daughter calling to me, he wrote. She was a woman of exceptional mind, gentle and kind in every way. Galileo now faced his final years in solitude, bearing the weight of truth he could no longer speak. In the years that followed, Galileo remained under house arrest in Arzetri. He had once enjoyed lively debates, frequent visitors, and the active life of a respected scholar. Now those days were gone. In his letters he occasionally signed his name from my prison and wrote that he felt as though he had been stricken from the pages of life. Yet his home was far from silent. Students came to assist him, living under his roof and continuing research at his side. His son stayed with him as well. At one point his sister-in-law and her children joined the household. Even under house arrest, visitors from across Europe travelled to see him. Among them was the English poet John Milton, who came to honour the ageing scientist. What gave Galileo renewed purpose was a return to his unfinished work. Years earlier, he had studied motion, but those findings had never been fully published. Now he expanded those experiments. His understanding of pendulums led him to design a more accurate timepiece, at a time when clocks could lose 30 minutes in a single day. His final book, Discourses Concerning Two New Sciences, explained the laws of motion and the strength of materials. It was smuggled out of Italy and printed in Holland in 1638. The work became foundational to modern physics. 50 years later, it inspired Isaac Newton in the development of the law of gravity. In his last years, Galileo lost his sight completely. Once he had revealed the heavens to the world through a telescope. Now he lived in darkness. Still he continued to work, dictating his thoughts to his son and his students. Galileo died on January 8, 1642, at the age of 78. His influence on science was profound. Albert Einstein would later describe him as the father of modern physics, indeed of modern science altogether. Galileo embodied the spirit of the Renaissance. He was a mathematician, philosopher, inventor, physicist, astronomer, skilled artist, and an eloquent writer. Over time, the sun-centered model of the solar system gained acceptance. In 1835, the Catholic Church lifted its ban on the works of Galileo and Copernicus. Then, in 1992, Pope John Paul II stated that the Church had been mistaken in its treatment of Galileo. The Church, he said, had acted in good faith, but had erred by turning a scientific question into a matter of doctrine. It was the very point Galileo had made centuries before. History has honoured him in many ways. One of the most meaningful came in 1989, when NASA launched a spacecraft to study Jupiter and its moons. Its name was the Galileo Orbiter,